Welcome to our webinar, The Power of Transatlantic Cooperation and How EU and US inventors joined forces in the fight against the pandemic. My name is Yvonne Bendinger-Rothschild. I'm the Executive Director of the EACC, and I will be your host for today's event. To make this program interactive and as informative as possible, we encourage our audience to ask questions. You can submit them through the menu bar on the bottom of your screen. This event is organized by the European American Chamber in New York in cooperation with the Embassy of the Slovak Republic in Washington, which suggested to organize the showcase of the amazing power of working together. And to stay in the theme of collaboration, we ask our friends at the Swedish American Chamber of Commerce in Washington to work with us and help line up a panelist to explain how Sweden has contributed to the joint EU-US effort to fight COVID-19. The pandemic has highlighted the importance of the private sector and the public-private partnerships in developing vaccines, therapeutics, and other medical products in response to COVID-19. And a variety of European and American companies have been contributing to life-saving solutions over the last couple of years, and research before even that. We knew about the pandemic coming up. The pandemic has also exposed the need for secure global supply chains and exposed the overdependence on third world countries. This program today will be a discussion with executives and officials who have worked on the front lines of the business aspects behind the COVID pandemic. And we will hear how they have made the impossible possible, created alliances across the Atlantic, and tackled this crisis in ways none of them had ever been doing before or even thought possible before the pandemic. Our speakers include Peter Gajdos. He's the executive chairman of a Slovak company called Chirana. They make life-saving ventilators. We have Bob Langer from the Koch Institute, where he is a professor. He also runs at MIT the Langer Lab. We have Elaine Brennan. She's the executive director of strategic partnership at Northwell Health and manages their venture fund. And our moderator today is Gareth Hagan. He's the deputy CEO of OOCO Global, who will moderate our discussion today. Gareth, with that, I hand over to you.
Thanks, Yvonne, and hello, everybody. Good morning, I guess, for our colleagues in the US, and good afternoon for colleagues in Europe. And look, it's great to be with you all today. And I'm going to keep my comments pretty brief because I'm the least interesting guy on the call. But just to introduce myself, I'm Gareth Hagan, Deputy CEO of OOCO Global, and we've been working and do work extensively across both the US and Europe, both with governments and companies. And so I've seen at firsthand some of the amazing collaboration and amazing cooperation through the pandemic. And I'm very excited about our panelists who've been much more in the eye of the storm, if I can describe it that way, basically bringing some of those experiences to life today. And I think fundamentally, if sort of the last 18 months have taught us anything, it's really that the capacity for achieving what we thought was impossible and making it possible. We've seen that time and time again. So, Vaughn, thanks for introducing the panel, basically. And so I think what we'll do is we'll try and jump right in and get into the discussion. It's been a little time since all of us, I guess, have been to the theatre, but if you stick with the acronym for now, basically, or stick with the story, we're going to take the panel in 3 acts today. So firstly, I'm going to talk a little bit to the panelists about their experiences from the pandemic and kind of the amazing initiatives that they've all been involved in. Secondly, we'll kind of unpack that a little bit more and understand how collaboration and cooperation, made some of the achievements possible. And I think thirdly, and I might even say most importantly, I'd also like to talk and hear from the panelists about the legacy of the pandemic, and the phrase basically, never letting a disaster go to waste springs to mind. And I think basically that, it would be a travesty if we didn't harness, some of the collaboration and cooperation that we've seen through the pandemic, kind of as part of the legacy, kind of after the pandemic as well. So look, without further ado, I'm going to jump straight in, basically. And Bob, maybe if I could start with you, actually, and if you'd allow me to sort of, maybe take you back to sort of January, February last year, I'd just be fascinated to kind of understand sort of, what went through your mind in those kind of couple of weeks as we all grappled with kind of what was ahead of us, and also kind of how it maybe prompted you to kind of progress and get into some of the activities that you've clearly been involved in, in the sort of 14, 16, 18 months since.
Sure. Well, if I go back then, I mean, I guess the first thing is, when did I hear about it? And actually, I remember we were actually overseas in Asia in December, and my daughter, heard about it, and we were actually going to be flying through the Hong Kong airport in, I think, January 3rd. And she was very concerned that we shouldn't even fly through it. But I mean, it turns out that the airport at that time wasn't so bad. But that was like the first time I heard about it. Also, one of the companies I helped start, Moderna, the CEO, Stefan Bancel, had heard about it, and we started an effort at Moderna in January to try to, see if we could make a COVID vaccine, which of course we did over time. But that was how I first started hearing about it. I think that we didn't really know. I mean, I'll give you my MIT perspective, because that's my main job. At MIT, I think we thought things wouldn't be nearly as bad as they've turned out to be. This is now in January, and even in February, I think that events and classes would go on. It really wasn't till, I would say, the very end of February, very beginning of March, when I think everybody realized just what a disaster it would be. The school would close down a few weeks later. But that's when that was just the first couple of months. And then once that did happen, and I can go over that more later, I probably got involved in about 10 different ways, and our lab got involved in about 10 different ways to try to help on everything from vaccines to masks to better blood tests to better ventilators to nasal sprays to understanding effects on the brain, all kinds of things.
Yeah, Bob, when you mentioned a number of, I suppose, the critical, topics, and I suppose have come to become the critical solutions as we come out of the pandemic, and a couple of V words that we're all kind of, very familiar with: vaccines, clearly, which we're all kind of obsessed about. I just had my second vaccine 1 hour ago, so hopefully I don't have any side effects during the panel. But the other V word, of course, that was very prevalent in the early days of the pandemic was, of course, ventilators, and the issue of ventilator supply, and making sure that we could get ventilators or get people on ventilators when we need them. It was certainly one of my enduring memories, Peter, of the early days of the pandemic. Both here in the UK where I live, but I know kind of across the world. And look, I know you've got a remarkable story to tell when we kind of come to the topic of ventilators, and it would just be great, to talk a little bit about that and to share your story.
Absolutely. So I'm I do the Transatlantic cooperation in my family, being originally from Slovakia, but having a dual citizenship and having an American wife. So I deal with this on a daily basis. In March, I've been approached by a couple of professors who came to me and said, look, we have this amazing technology that we believe is very suitable for COVID. And by the way, it's not just on a paper, it's fully approved, and it's in a ventilator. We just need to find a way to get it out into the world. That company happened to be from Slovakia. It was Hirana. So what we decided to do is we realized that there was not enough capacity in the local manufacturing that they had, which was in Slovakia and Russia. We decided we need to try to find capacity in the US. So we partnered with a couple of groups in Boston and managed to produce ventilators. It wasn't a regular emergency ventilators that got produced. This was a super complex ventilator with 2,000 separate components that was very much deemed for ICU. Normally the project would take 2 to 3 years in terms of technology transfer. You have hundreds of drawings, 2,000 components, thousands of pages to translate the regulatory documents. Well, we managed to squeeze it into 5 to 6 months. And although we couldn't help in wave one had to be served from the local facility. Wave 2, I'm proud to say, we are now helping in places that we couldn't even imagine, from Brazil to Peru, now also sending things to India that are helping the toughest, most difficult cases of patients. Not a kind of first line of defense. This is really the last line of defense when patient is pretty much guaranteed to die unless you do something. So it was a remarkable journey, but I can say we made it work, and people live because of that.
Great. Peter, we'll come back to sort of the transatlantic nature of that later in the discussion, but I'd just like to bring Elaine in at this point. And Elaine, certainly, from a US perspective and looking, into the US in the early days of the pandemic, I mean, I think it's fair to say that New York was the epicenter of things kind of at the beginning, and we saw that on a daily basis, the Como press conferences and sort of some of the scenes around the city and the greater area. I mean, obviously at Northwell, you've been a significant healthcare kind of system, kind of within that part of the country. Could you just, talk to us a little bit about, kind of how that felt at the time, and sort of what some of the kind of the conversations and some of the actions that were taken kind of within sort of your kind of broader group kind of looked like, and the role, I suppose, that, kind of even at that stage, perhaps some of the cooperations and alliances played in that?
Sure, yeah, and greetings from New York. So I suppose personally speaking, everyone knows New York to be this pulsating city, the city that never sleeps. And literally overnight, it turned into a ghost town. I've lived here through 9/11. I've never seen anything quite like this. So from a personal perspective, it certainly was, quite traumatic for everyone here. From a business perspective, I felt very fortunate. I'm not a frontline worker, and, to get to work from the business side from home. So watching my colleagues on the front lines and dealing with so many unknowns, at the time we all remember, who knew what worked, and, not even being able to go home to their families after long, rigorous, gruesome days, especially in the early days. So, if you think back to the days, and I'm sure, Peter, this wasn't you, but there was so much about PPE, everything was PPE. How do we get it? How do we eliminate the frauds? How do we get, as much as we possibly can to a system as big as Northwell, where we have 77,000 employees, cover 4 million lives, etc. So, even ventilators, as you mentioned, Peter, like in the day they jumped literally in a few days from 19,000 to 65,000. This is a big hit for health systems, and there was a lot of, I suppose, unknown chaos at the time. And my role as head of pharma ventures, not ventures, I do partner with our ventures team, but was that we had forged synergistic relationships with the pharma biotech industry over a number of years. And I think part of that was assisting our colleagues with sourcing, recruiting, therapeutics, diagnostics. At one point there was, no one really knew what worked. If you remember, we went back from RA drugs at one point were hot, all the way through to like famotidine, Pepcid AC. We didn't really know what worked. So this is where our pharma alliances sort of stepped up to the plate. We were able to pick up the phone. For example, one RA drug, the request was what we needed in our health system was what the weekly allocation the distributor had for the entire US geography. So because of that relationship, picked up the phone to the CEO of the pharma company. Within 24 hours, we had it. So I think having these relationships, really proved very valuable through COVID and through the unknowns, and it just shows you like that the power of them. So that's sort of a bit of a snapshot in dealing with COVID in New York City.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned the word chaos, and certainly if I take myself back, kind of it felt like that in many kind of instances as we were grappling with this within healthcare systems and sort of in business and really kind of across kind of society. But I suppose sort of, Peter, chaos doesn't build sophisticated ventilators, and I can imagine that basically the degree of kind of planning and the degree of sort of preparation that you alluded to in your opening remarks was kind of critical to making that project a success. Given that the theme today is around collaboration and cooperation, just like to go back a little bit to your experiences, and maybe if you could just sort of give us an insight into kind of what that looked like, and really sort of that transatlantic sort of alliance. And I think when we spoke kind of prior to this call, you said to me there probably are only a couple of places in the world where we could have done this. And so what were some of those kind of factors that contributed to you doing it in the way you did on the sort of the Europe to US axis?
Yeah.
I think you're sorry, Peter, I think you're on mute.
Absolutely. It was a very difficult process that was pretty remarkably chaotic and difficult to manage in terms of the time zones and timelines. But in the end, we managed to pull a very nice consortium together that consisted of Kirana, which is a company based in Slovakia. There's also some facilities in Russia and Uzbekistan. We, as IPM Group, which is a global investor with offices in San Francisco, London, Bratislava, and Seoul, Korea. SMTC, which is a Canadian company that has a facility in Boston, and NDA Partners, that is a regulatory consultancy. And on top of that, you had to put the regulatory and the political oversight. There were two main problems besides what I mentioned around documents and translations and just sheer paperwork and transferring the processes. One problem is how to get physically engineers to a location where we're going to produce or to get them to Slovakia. So trying to fly in the middle of the pandemic, getting ministerial exemptions, preparing all the tests, things that at this point are standardized, but at that point not. At some point we even considered, do we need to fly a government plane to get people in? In the end, we managed to get people in, but it was quite a process. There was a lot of hesitancy as well. Like, America was in the throes of wave one. Slovakia had no wave one. Workers were scared. They're telling us, are we going to get sick because these people are coming in infected? So there was a lot of that. So thank you to the ministry and to the embassy who helped us. I remember a call to the consul. Hey, they don't want to let this Cree engineer onto the plane because he is missing a piece of paperwork. So the consulate translated within 30 minutes some document that we were able to board a plane. So one part was people. Second part was components. You can see that now as well. Component shortage and supply chain strain was a thing from day one. It wasn't a thing just post the pandemic. It was a thing from day one. Nobody in that industry was ready to have that level of components. So we were sourcing components from the most random pieces of the world. Sometimes we self-made things, and you needed even tools to actually manufacture things. Fortunately, we had a couple of local MacGyvers in Boston, and that was the area that I picked or we picked because I realized you need to go to the center of medical device research. You don't need to scale to huge productions. You need to be fast. And Boston turned out to the place that could do this. So you take a technology from Slovakia, you apply the Boston brains and engineering on top of it, and the results will happen. So it was extremely difficult, but we did source them. We did get the people through, and here we are producing now at a level of sort of 20 to 25 a week, which doesn't sound like a lot if you talk about emergency ventilators. But if you talk about ICU ventilators, that's a big number. That's a big number because that's 1,000 a year for the toughest patients.
Yeah, absolutely, Peter, and that combination that you mentioned of kind of Boston and Slovakia, is kind of clearly in this instance has been kind of quite the duo, and many other examples I'm sure that we'll talk about as well. Maybe Bob, just on Boston, I'll come back to you actually, and you mentioned kind of rather modestly in your introduction that you sort of just set to work to sort of develop a vaccine, and obviously you did that sort of via Moderna sort of but despite your sort of humility, it's an incredible sort of achievement, and I know it's not the only one basically that you've worked on through the pandemic, Bob. So look, I think our kind of sort of attendees today would be fascinated to talk a little bit about some of the areas that you've worked on, but I think particularly, Bob, just some of those kind of key moments that maybe kind of made things happen and maybe made years into months and months into weeks, which I know was a kind of common theme in terms of bringing sort of innovations, whether it's vaccines or other things to market. So I think we'd all just be fascinated to sort of hear a little bit more from you on not just Moderna, but I know some of the other things you've been involved in as well.
Sure. Well, again, but I don't want to. Moderna is now 1,300 people, and believe me, it's them, not me. I helped, the early work in our laboratory, and this often happens in academia. We must be going back close to 50 years. We developed the first ways to deliver nucleic acids through nanoparticles, which we published in Nature, and that, I think ended up being important in terms of letting people realize that you could do that type of thing. And But you know, and when I helped found Moderna, I mean, a lot of people there did a fantastic job of developing much better nanoparticles than I ever did, and I think that you know, and that's how science works. I think that's what you want to see. But I felt that our academic work was important in terms of showing what was possible and how to do it, and it really changed conventional wisdom so that now, you know, nanoparticles are widely used. So I feel we did make contributions, but lots of people would end up making, you know, a giant team effort. In fact, all the way around, just again on Moderna, you know, so Moderna themselves, itself, the company has had people doing great work on messenger RNA, on nanoparticles, and on manufacturing. But they actually collaborate with companies all over the world. In fact, in Sweden, Recipharm has been very involved in the manufacturing of the Moderna vaccine in terms of formulation and fill and finish. But I can't emphasize enough how it's just a team effort by many people at Moderna and across the world. I'm still a MIT professor, and you know, doing basic science and research, and our hope is that those kinds of things will lead to you know, systems for the future. So to give you a couple of examples, like you asked, you know, we've actually had this. Must have been close to 10 years ago. We came up with this idea of putting like microneedles in a pill that you could swallow, so that maybe someday you could deliver large molecules like insulin or you know, or even vaccines someday. You know, it's hard to say, but would have a little pill that could do that. And so we published that, and then Novo Nordisk, which is in Denmark, contacted me, and Gio Traverso, who was working with me, and we've had a huge collaboration with them to try to create a pill. We published this, one of the papers in Science, you know, in 2019, another in Nature Medicine. And the hope is that by the end of this year, Novo Nordisk will now have it in the clinic. But, you know, a lot of the basic work was at MIT. And in fact, Nicholas Rockstead from KTH did a sabbatical with us, and that's in Sweden also, and he came over and did a fantastic job. He's an expert on microneedles. In fact, I could probably even show people the pill. I don't know how. I'll try. It's actually quite cute. It's a pill that is sort of tiny. It's like this. Maybe people can just sort of see it. There's a little hole in it, and we can make the needle be just the drug. Like insulin's been the target for a lot of these because, but the needle's inside it, and the needle is made pretty much entirely of insulin. But we have a way to project that out. But one of the things that's really key is that you want to make sure that it always lands facing the stomach wall. So we actually modeled it as what's called the leopard tortoise, which will always self-right itself. And so when you swallow it, it might tumble, but it'll always end up with this needle part face down. And I'll try to illustrate that here. You can do it 1,000 times out of 1,000. It'll always do that. And so that's that ended up being a terrific collaboration. And then, by the way, even on ventilators, I mean, I don't know that we've done anything like Peter, but one of my students, Shreya Srivanasan, she actually worked and developed a way to split ventilators. We actually published that in Science Translational Medicine, and you know, she set up a foundation and really trying to help the people in India with it. And another one of my former postdocs, Ziad Vakil, he actually worked out a way to make very cheap ventilators, probably about $200, just taking parts from like Radio Shack. So we've tried on different areas, and there's others too. I mean, there's like people in the lab are working on all kinds of things, and there's quite a few companies that we've been involved with that are also working on a lot of these things.
Thanks, Bob. And basically, the Radio Shack ventilator is a new one for me, basically, but it shows basically the power of sort of ingenuity, I guess, and creativity. And look, you talked about teamwork, and you know, sort of all of this kind of started with science. And Elaine, I suppose, you know, in your role at Northwell, you know, you're interfacing with R&D, you're interfacing with kind of corporates and kind of companies of all kind of sizes. And I know that there was active dialogue, and that certainly didn't slow down during the sort of pandemic period, and sort of right up to today, basically. But we just sort of talk to us a little bit about maybe some of the sort of the impacts and some of the things within the Northwell system that sort of arose from some of those conversations, either to sort of deal with the pandemic itself or to kind of keep a healthcare system running, kind of in spite of a pandemic. And it'd be fascinating just to sort of touch upon a few of those.
Sure, yeah, and I think I mentioned earlier, like one of my roles is the Pharma Ventures component, which forges the innovative partnerships with the pharma biotech, which are global companies. But another key and which maintains and is continuing to be a core part of what we do, which is our strategic partnerships with the likes of trade boards, around the world. So what we do is we look for innovative companies who might have unique solutions from either high value, disruptive in their space, clinical benefits, whether they're looking for clinical trials. So, we have a number of these partnerships, and, they proved to be very, very important during COVID because of their unique solutions that we may not have had here in the States. And, a lot of these companies are smaller, mid-sized companies. They're indigenous to their countries. So they tend to be a little bit more agile. And so it really lends itself to us working closely with them, especially when we're under that much stress and pressure to create those solutions, clinical solutions. But when we look at companies from overseas, my role is to sort of say, well, where do they fit, and are they, important enough for us? So, a lot of the thanks I get are from companies that I might say to them, you're just not ready, you don't have enough funding to be in the States, and knowing your market and all that is super important. So that saves a lot of time, energy, resources, as you can imagine, to put it into another market per se. The US is a very expensive market to enter into, and knowing sales cycles and that. But here at Northwell, when we meet companies, I sort of triage them into 3 different buckets, like clinical trials. So they're companies, innovative companies that might be looking to have a baseline in the US for FDA approval, etc. So we have a huge and sophisticated clinical trial program here at Northwell. We also, if they're not clinical trial, then maybe procurement. So are they a finished product? Are they high value, lower cost? So we look at it from a procurement perspective. And then, of course, there's the ventures arm. I work very closely with our head of ventures, Rich Mullery, who looks at ways, and we have our own fund where we look to invest in overseas companies, and we have done quite a few with our overseas partners through our trade board alliances. It's interesting because I'm Irish, so worked very closely with Enterprise Ireland, but relationships in the United States are key. Knowing your market, the cost, the sales cycle is pivotal, because if you have much longer sales cycle than you anticipated, you're going to be burning up. So there's a lot of this whole international program is really key to Michael Dowling, our CEO, to innovation, and to keeping it more of a global platform than just sort of national.
Yeah, absolutely, Elaine, and we see that time and time again, basically, that your point around kind of company having an ambition to sort of to break through in a market, and then actually the kind of the practicalities of that is something that I suppose that we're both involved in on a daily basis in terms of helping companies, particularly doing that in the US market. Look, I suppose to sort of shift gear a little bit. I mean, COVID, a huge human problem, and ultimately sort of solutions kind of conceived and delivered by humans as well. And we've talked about scientists, we've talked about innovators, we've talked about business people, but certainly one of my own reflections, kind of, in the pandemic, and certainly here in Europe, is, I think kind of, our perspective of sort of, I suppose, a definition of the front line has kind of changed profoundly. And I hope, kind of, for the long term, when we think about nurses and we think about the healthcare professionals who've actually kind of, helped us to get through this. And I know, Elaine, at Northwell, basically, that sort of sentiment, is kind of keenly felt, and, that sort of front line, be it nurses, be your kind of staff, kind of the work in the hospitals, basically, you've undertaken a number of initiatives in the sort of maybe the second half of the pandemic, if I can describe it that, to sort of, kind of, recognize and just kind of put the spotlight on those populations. I think it'd be lovely to hear about some of that.
Yeah, no, great. As I mentioned earlier, I had the luxury, and which I felt was a real luxury, to work from home during the initial stages. So you know, just knowing from a completely different perspective what we were able to do, partnered with the group called Nurse Heroes. And, you know, that group of philanthropists and amazing people, innovators and people who brought sort of new ideas to the table. With the shortage of nurses, you know, as mentioned or as documented by the World Health Organization, in the next 2 years, it's going to be 1 million less nurses in the United States. Nurses, you know, are key, obviously, from a frontline perspective. So our empathy, you know, was across all frontline staff, especially nurses during this time. And given 2020 was the 100-year anniversary of the suffragettes, also the 200-year anniversary of Florence Nightingale's birth, we partnered with the Nurse Heroes group and basically created some amazing initiatives to highlight, to elevate, and to draw attention to this shortage, that this tsunami is coming around the corner. So what we did was we had an amazing concert. I'll just give you some snapshots. An amazing concert Thanksgiving Day with celebrities like Oprah, Celine Dion, Josh Groban, and Andrew Bocelli, and created as well a Northwell or Nurse Hero choir. Some nurses from Northwell sang at this concert, and you know, drawing attention as well to, as I mentioned, the needs to address the shortage of nurses in the future. And Nurse Heroes has committed to raising funds to address that shortage by supplying scholarships and support for scholarships to nurses. So, you know, the beauty and the joy that this choir brought is that it got the attention of NBC. And for those of you on the phone who may not be aware of America's Got Talent, it's a big TV show here, but our nurses got straight through to the final with the golden buzzer last week. So we're very proud. And in August, we're going to have our choir come back again to America's Got Talent for the final. And, you know, it's just really enlightening and joyful to be able to come out of COVID acknowledging nurses in this really magnificent way. So I will happy to provide a link for all of you who haven't seen the concert or are interested to hear our nurses sing. You know, sort of in tandem as well, you know, one of my other roles is managing an organization or family office, Carlisle Philanthropy, and met a fabulous couple from California who, Sandy and Bill Nicholson, who have spent the last 30 years collecting female-only art and have created an art collection called The Women Who Dared. So it sort of was in line with the whole theme of nurses being over 90% of nurses are women. And, you know, we at Northwell just received The Women Who Dared. We launched it a couple of weeks ago, and the collection is now on view for our patients and staff throughout our 23 hospitals and 800 ambulatory groups. So it's been sort of a feel-good, not just feel-good, but also very important campaign that I was able to be part of and very proud of with my team, Jennifer Scanlon, and others across Northwell.
Well, look, I think we'd all love to see the video, Elaine, basically, and you know, if they were to win, basically, I mean, a small legacy, but I think a very positive one, and I think we all agree with that, basically, that you know, if we can sort of, you know, recognize and sort of, you know, kind of change perception perhaps about, you know, kind of some of those kind of you know, populations, you know, so much for the better, basically, because I think we've all seen sort of, you know, the last 18 months the basically the public service that they provide. So thank you for that. And look, I suppose, Peter, you know, if I think about, you know, change that we want to drive in this kind of concept of legacy, I mean, we've talked a lot about the healthcare, you know, industry specifically, but, you know, I would say that, you know, not only in healthcare, but, you know, frankly, you know, kind of multiple industry kind of sectors have been disrupted and possibly kind of changed forever as a result of what's happened, you know, in the last 18 months in terms of, you know, business models, you know, technology advancement, kind of, etc. But of course, you know, that doesn't happen, you know, kind of at a click of the fingers. It normally requires capital. It normally requires sort of, you know, kind of collaboration. I know that you're very much in that space. I'd just be kind of interested, Peter, in your sort of thoughts around, you know, what does that landscape look like in terms of, you know, innovation, ventures, funding, kind of, etc., kind of coming out of the pandemic, and what would your kind of, you know, kind of outlook and your kind of wish be for that as we kind of, you know, hopefully get to more normal times?
Yeah, I think the way I look at this pandemic, even though it's been a very tragic period, I do view it ultimately as a triumph of science. You know, the vaccines were produced in record time. There were new ventilator technologies, as Robert mentioned, introduced. So to me, I think the value of human innovation has further increased, and biotech has come to the forefront and medical devices. So that's number one. I think that's a wonderful outcome. I think the second outcome that I see is that people have realized that a lot of things maybe can be done remotely, and work commuting and flying to certain things. Maybe that's a good thing for the environment as well. So I think that's a second outcome. I think the third thing that I see coming out of this is I do believe that the transatlantic cooperation is alive and well. Yes, countries have, hoarded supplies and managed to their own constituents, but I do believe that the transatlantic cooperation has proven to be useful. We're a prime example. There are a lot of other examples where we've seen this. I think the three things that I think the lessons that I see that need to be learned is, one is the need for local production. I think we, in wave one, we've been all slapped in the face, and I don't want to get political, but in my view, in wave one, China has failed as the global supplier of components and materials. It's utterly failed on that perspective. I don't want to get into the virus, etc., but that has served as a wake-up call to both the North American as well as European governments. The need for local productions for certain critical emergency components must be there. So that's number one. Number two, there has to be more margin for error. We cannot be running these super strained, super efficient systems that with any wobble will just collapse. And you've seen this 3 or 4 times, time after time. You can mention the flight traffic, you can mention the Suez Canal. Now there's a problem at a Chinese port that had a COVID outbreak. We cannot live like that. For 5 cents of margin, we basically threaten the lives of people. So I think that's a second lesson that has to be learned, and there has to be a cushion built into the system. And that, by the way, will not happen on a private corporation. The public and regulators will be important, and just mandating these margins into the system. The same way you have margins in the electricity system. If you had no margins in Texas, the grid would have collapsed even worse than it did. You need to have margins. And I think the third one, which is an old adage in any crisis management, but comes to technology, is preposition of supplies. But I'd like to add to that, it's not just about preposition of supplies, but actually maintaining those supplies and making sure they are operable. How many stories were there of governments opening their safes and say, oh, we have ventilators, and guess what, they're not working, right? That needs to not be the case. There has to be not just the capex spend on, okay, we're going to spend these ventilators or emergency drug. There needs to be also spending on maintaining these supplies that are prepositioned. Otherwise, the first 2 months will be tragic, just like they were in wave 1, wave 2. So I think some of these lessons need to be applied, and I think overall I'm optimistic. Innovation, human ingenuity is a wonderful thing, but we have to build in these margins not to let ourselves slip into the disaster of wave 1 and then obviously the complacency of wave 2 that turned out to be even worse. So I think that would be my lessons from this pandemic.
Yeah, and I fully agree, Peter. As someone who spends a large part of his career, kind of looking at FDI and supporting kind of national governments around international investments, and I think it's absolutely the case that sort of global value chains have failed us in some regards, kind of through the last 18 months, and the sort of structure and underlying economics, I think, as you alluded to, of those arrangements definitely need a review, basically, because they've definitely been found wanting. So I fully agree with your sentiments. Robert, perhaps if I can kind of come back full circle, and you started off and told us about your kind of flight to Hong Kong or from Hong Kong, sort of 12, 14 months ago. You're obviously now kind of back on home turf, I assume, basically. But just given the breadth and given some of the sort of initiatives you've been involved in over the last year and more, I'd really and I'm sure everyone would love to hear your thoughts about what are the areas of positive legacy that you most hope will endure from this kind of pandemic, and if that is the case, kind of what positive impact will that have kind of on sort of on industry and on kind of healthcare systems and sort of the world at large. Basically, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. Well, I think I really agree with what Peter said, that was actually his first point, and I think he said it very well. I'll amplify it, but I think he articulated it exactly right. I mean, I think what I like to think is that the pandemic really shows the power and the importance of science, in particular, biotechnology science, and just exactly what it can do. And to me, it is a tremendous victory, not just the vaccines, but everything about what we can do with science. And I think science can do so much more, and in so many areas of technology and of the world. So I think that to me is the legacy. I hope the world knows that and has learned it. Sometimes I'm not sure. People often have short memories, and I also think that it the points that Peter made about innovation is there's science, but there's also taking that science and making it useful for the world, and I think that's also really important. International cooperation is important, but you can see when you look at the news media. I mean, there's a lot of divisiveness, a lot of people saying, having very different opinions about what should be done, and it's complicated. It's not straightforward about the right ways to distribute vaccines, about trying to figure out what to do so that we don't have future pandemics, or at least reduce the chances of them. But I think the most important thing, like I say, to me is showing that biology, biomedical engineering, and technologies like that can really just and actually rapidly, change the face of medicine. And if it wasn't for these things, I think we'd be in a very different place today.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we all have a much greater appreciation of that, Bob. So fully agree with you on that. Very good. Well, look, I'm conscious we've got a couple of questions from the audience actually that I'd like to go to, and I'm maybe going to start off with a kind of quick fire one actually, which we got through basically, which I'd be keen to. I don't want to put people on the spot basically, but the question is, if there was one thing that you wish you knew sort of 12 months ago that you know now, what would that be? So maybe good to hear from, and don't all fight at once answer kind of first basically, but I'll maybe put you on the spot, Peter. One thing that you sort of wish you knew 12 months ago that you didn't, but you know now.
I think when we were starting this project, we were going to focus on Europe, Middle East, North America. I wish I realized even more than what a global city we are. At that point, we were focused on those regions. We did not appreciate the extent to which it's going to hit emerging markets. And I wish I had a better appreciation of how interconnected we are, because you see what happened in Brazil, you see what happened in India now, what's happening in Peru and Colombia. I wish I had a better appreciation, because in the end we ended up serving these markets, and I think whether it's ventilators, whether it's vaccines, unless you solve the problem globally, you will not solve the problem. We may be declaring victory here in the United States, but there are billions of people still going through incredible misery right now because of the pandemic. They're nowhere near the vaccination rates they need to be. So I think my thing is, I never appreciated that US and Europe will find a way to take care of themselves, but I think we need to help to take care of the rest of the world as well. So I think that's my main outcome that I wasn't aware. And I think if I knew that, I would be banging even harder about how we need to help the emerging markets besides ourselves.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And Elaine, from your side, sort of one thing that you know now but wish you knew?
Yeah, no, I think that, at the end of the day, you don't want a pandemic to have to make things, to realize things that, oh, we should have thought about that. But I definitely think that, when the business processes break down in the early days, that it just shows and highlights the importance of relationships, and not to minimize all of the research and the innovation that is also critical, but relationships do matter, and having those solid relationships whether they're between countries or between organizations or between interdisciplinary teams. It's something that we cannot, sort of minimize or mitigate.
Yeah, and easy to forget that, I guess, in the eye of the storm. But good to get that reminder, as you say, kind of, Elaine, and hopefully, it doesn't take another pandemic or another sort of major event, basically, for us all to realize sort of the power of that. So no, I fully agree. And from your side, Paul, basically, kind of one thing that sort of kind of stands out that you kind of you wish you knew 12 months ago, but maybe perhaps didn't.
Yeah, well, 12 months ago it was still June last year. I mean, so by that time we were pretty into having the pandemic be really bad. I'll just speak personally. I mean, a lot of people criticized me and Moderna. Kept saying, a lot of scientists, that the vaccine would never work. And I think that can't be a positive for all the people really trying to work hard, and of course I think we had good data on what's called a phase 1 trial, but you don't know what's going to happen until you get to the phase 3 trial. So I think that I wish the world and we knew what the phase 3 data were. I think that certainly we really didn't know that till we broke the code in November. So I think that would have been probably good to know if we're going back to June. But if we're going back to January, I would have liked to seen us make a lot greater effort on masks and shutting a lot of things down. So I think it depends what month. I mean, almost every month you picked last year, there might be a slightly different answer.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right, this a rapidly changing kind of scene, and the priorities changing on a, if not daily, as you sort of say, kind of weekly kind of basis as we've gone through this. So no, you're right, and you're right to pick me up on not being specific enough in my question, Bob. So thanks for that, basically. But no, I joke.
I was trying to be.
I joke, exactly. Well, look, another question from the audience here, actually. So look, we've heard, and I'm sort of ad-libbing here in terms of question, but we've heard from all of you in terms of the sort of amazing experiences and sort of some of the lessons kind of learned. But the question is kind of how are you going to apply, or what's the lesson that you're going to apply basically from the pandemic, basically into the world kind of beyond the pandemic. So again, I don't know basically who wants to start, but Elaine, I know that there's kind of a number of things within the hospital system that you did during the pandemic that'll probably kind of become normal kind of as we move forward, basically. But maybe you talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think from a clinical perspective, there's certain areas like telehealth, and I know for with respect to wound care, our head of Dr. Arpalos, made great strides in getting whether it's reimbursement from the government. I believe that's going to stay. So from a clinical perspective, there's certainly been a lot of silver linings here. From my perspective, I guess my crusade will be this whole area around nurses and highlighting the importance of nurses, elevating their roles, whether it's from forging more relationships like what we did do with the celebrities, and making sure that this is not going away. It's something that we definitely need to address as a global issue. So I think for me, that would be my take home, is what can we further do, like leveraging the partnerships that we have with pharma, leveraging the partnerships with our international partners, and of course with the philanthropists and all of the people that stood up to the plate during COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. And Bob, your own sort of reflections in terms of the learnings that will be sort of reapplied and shape some of your work and your team's work in the future.
Well, I think, like I say, one of the things is reinforcing the science that we do. I mean, in fact, like half our lab's work is actually aimed at trying to help the developing world, and some of it is with vaccines. These are more futuristic vaccines where you might be able to give single step method, one injection and maybe have 12 pulses. This is something we've published in Science. There's still further to go before it's ready for the clinic. But I think that, and also, like I say, making things easier to do by oral administration and so forth. So I think it reinforces some of the science that we have been doing for the last 5-10 years with Bill Gates and his foundation. I also think, as a professor, and this goes again to Peter's point, that was the second point earlier, that you know, it's amazing to me how, you know, I get asked to, you know, lecture all over the world, and I don't actually like to get on airplanes. And I think that, you know, it's exhausting. You can get sick very, you know, unfortunately, all too easy. So I've noticed that I have not had a cold in the last 18 months. You know, I'm sure a lot of that has to do with not being, I mean, not that a cold is the worst thing, but I'd rather not have it. And so I feel like one of the things that's been good is that you can, and this our discussion today is a good example of it, that in the Zoom world or whatever we want to call it, you can communicate differently. So, you know, I can give lectures to, you know, to Japan or Singapore or wherever, and you know, normally I would keep saying no because you know, it takes a couple of days to get over there and it's exhausting. But you know, I've done a lot more of those, and you know, that to me is meaningful. I have students in all these places, and so again, there's no substitute for seeing people, but it's nice that we can give lectures, you know, over video.
Agree. And Bob, as someone who's had a bad back, I think, from too many overnight flights over the last 5 years, my back's never felt better. So I totally empathize with you over the last couple of years as well. Peter, I'm just going to give the floor over to you, actually, just for a sort of final comment in terms of, you know, your sort of takeaway and kind of what you'll apply, kind of, you know, as we come out of the pandemic over the coming months.
I think the things that I'm going to apply, I already mentioned them before. But I think just to add to that, I think the lesson is that innovation doesn't just come from Silicon Valley or Boston, right? Innovation can come from all corners of the world, right? Here in Silicon Valley, I tend to sit here and think this is the greatest thing since sliced bread. Sometimes you get humbled by what local scientists in random corners of the world come up with. So I think that's a big lesson. And we'll be starting a fund to make sure that we do this transatlantic cooperation and taking technologies from the one side of the Atlantic to the other, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that's a big lesson. The second thing is, and I'm going to say this as a venture capitalist, you know, public-private partnerships, if done right, can be very helpful. You know, as a venture capitalist, I tend to sit in my ivory tower and do things, you know, as just purely scientists. Getting government officials involved and getting their support can help things societally, economically, politically. So getting them involved at the right level and the right fashion can be very helpful. So I think we all malign the roles of governments. I think here, if done right, you know, that could be very helpful. And so I think this is part of the transatlantic cooperation. So, you know, getting government involved in science is not a disaster. It could be helped. It just has to be applied right.
Yeah, no, here, Peter, I fully agree with you. And yeah, I think that would be a great sort of legacy if we reset sort of the sort of public-private sort of dimension as you describe it. I think that would be a powerful kind of legacy for us all. Well, look, I just want to personally thank all three of you for your kind of contributions over the last 45 minutes. So it's definitely been a fascinating discussion and an amazing sort of you know, kind of wide variety of kind of views, whatever. So I know that Yvonne basically was kind of keen to say a few words, and perhaps from some of our hosts as well, basically, but just to kind of give you my own sort of thanks for your time. And Yvonne, I'll pass back to yourself.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, everyone. I'm super happy to hear that everyone agrees that the transatlantic relationship is and collaboration is alive and well. And I absolutely agree with the notion that we need to build relationships, because relationships is what everybody pulled in to make the impossible possible. You know, Garrett's team built on relationship. You know, Elaine, Bob, Peter, everybody pulled relationships out of nowhere and out of every Rolodex that they had sitting around someplace, and made that, you know, and revived them and connected people and made this a joint effort, really joint effort. And I see the same in my role at the EICC. There's a lot of activity coming from the EU and US companies, not only in planning to expand, but also looking for partners. And I'm not sure if that's going to address the need for a more localized production, but I think it should help getting us towards that direction. And maybe that can also address the need to address the margin of error issue, which I again completely agree with. We need to build backups and more flexibility in the system. But Karin, can we hear you?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh wow, that's the phrase of 2020. Can you hear me, or you are on mute? But thank you, Yvonne, and thank you to speakers Bob, Peter, Elaine, and moderator Gareth, whom we may not have been able to get to Bob's point about declining the engagement which involves a flight. And thank you, listeners, for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us today to take stock of the collaborative transatlantic efforts by so many to fight the pandemic. I did want to mention that the Swedish American Chambers of Commerce, with its 20 chapters and 3,000 members across the US, have hosted several science, pharma, and medtech delegations from Sweden, and during the pandemic in an online format, to make science useful to the world, as Bob so eloquently put it. And to Peter's point, science and innovation is indeed happening in all corners of the world. So please do not hesitate to contact Yvonne or me if you have a product, service, or idea that you would like to promulgate. Thank you all. Over to you, Yvonne.
So with that, thank you, Karin. With that, we conclude today's webinar. Again, thank you to our panelists for sharing your insights, and Garrett for moderating the discussion. And we will be uploading a recording of this program to our YouTube channel and send the link to all of the participants. If you want to connect with anyone who attended the program, let us know. We will be happy to facilitate that. Thank you very much.